Welcome everyone. My name is Greg Kim. I'm a co-founder of Business Law Corps, which is a nonprofit that was formed to help businesses get off the ground. And we started this series called Restart Hawaii to help all of you and small businesses in Hawaii restart. Um, and especially with the pandemic, I think we've had a lot of casualties along the way. And so we just want to do our part to help Hawaii get back on its feet. So thank you for coming. This is the 8th seminar in our series. We are pleased to have Chenise here to talk about finding a location and leasing a location. We've had other webinars, and I think you've all received the flyer. So after this last webinar in the series, we're going to post the recordings and the materials in a manual. That might take us a month or two to put together. Since you're here, you're going to get a direct email link to those materials. So you should keep an eye out for that. Let's see here, just a few other messages. We're recording this, as I mentioned, so note that if you turn on your video or turn on your voice, you're going to be seen or heard, and that's going to be part of the recording. So if you don't want that to happen, then, just wanted to warn you. Business Law Corps, I mentioned, is a nonprofit. Our website is under construction now. I'll post it in the chat, but there's 3 types of services we provide. Well, a few types. We provide seminars like this, webinars, and we're going to try to do more of that in the future. We provide consulting each week, half-hour free consultations with a business lawyer, and that happens at the Patsy Mink Center for Business and Leadership, as well as the Entrepreneurship Sandbox. There's signups for that, and if I can find them, I'll post them. But you can just also Google those 2 organizations, and I'm sure their sites have signups for that. And we provide legal representation for small businesses that need help, free of charge, if you qualify financially, and if it sounds like a promising business. So we have those kind of 3 areas. Want to give a quick shout out to our interns, Stefanos and Christian, who are 3rd-year law students at the University of Hawaii. They've helped us with the flyers, with editing the chapters, and so I want to really thank them for joining us on this. And also, we will take questions, but we'll take them at the end just to keep things moving along during the presentation. So you can either put your question in the chat to everyone, or you can private message me in the chat any questions you have. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to Chenise. She's the founder of a firm called Ziva Law, and she can tell you what that means, but it means shine a light and be, brilliant and be all that you can be. And I'm sure I'm not saying it right, but she can fill you in on that. She's dedicated her life to small business and to helping them find and lease property. So I think that's a wonderful resource for Hawaii, that she would be willing to do that. It's not a lot of law firms that focus on small business. It takes a certain skill set, takes a certain willingness to work with smaller companies. And so I applaud her for that focus. And I know she's quite busy with that, so it's working out well for her. And she has a fabulous background in law and before law. And you can actually, I'll post her bio in the chat so we don't have to take a lot of the time with that. But she's a very accomplished lawyer. And without further delay on that, let me turn it over to Chenise. If you want to say a few words about yourself to add what I said, that'd be great. And she's going to share her screen and walk through the presentation. By the way, I'm going to post links to her presentation as well as the materials for this webinar in the chat, probably at about 10:30, to make sure that everyone's signed on by when I do that. So look out for that in your chat. So Chenise, please take it away.
Okay, let's see here. Let me do my screen, get my screen share set up for you. Here we go. There, so can you see my slide, my cover slide?
Yes.
Yes, perfect, excellent. So let me just also make sure I get set up here with the chat box. There you go. I want to be able to see what's going on with the chat as well. Excellent. Okay, well, thank you so much for being here today with us. Business Law Corp has put together this wonderful Restart Hawaii webinar series. And I wanted to thank Greg and Kat also, who is not able to be here today, for organizing this amazing project. I'm very honored that you invited me to be a part of it. So Greg and Kat asked me to speak to you today on the topic of commercial leasing for new businesses. So this is a basic level. You know, if you're someone who's negotiated many leases, you might be more advanced than the focus of today's presentation. But hopefully you'll take away something valuable along the way. So I'm very excited to talk commercial leasing with you this morning. Now, but first, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on me. I am, just a local girl born and raised on Oahu. When I became an attorney, I spent the first years of my practice actually doing civil litigation. And so those are the attorneys that go to court and argue before judges and juries. And I quickly realized that it wasn't a good fit for me. I just hated fighting all the time. And I realized that I'm much happier as a deal attorney. So after that, I spent most of my career doing commercial real estate development and finance transactions. So basically negotiating contracts and drafting contracts and all of that good stuff. Then a few years ago in 2018, I took the entrepreneurial leap myself and started my new law firm, Ziva Law. Which, as Greg mentioned, Ziva is a Hebrew name for a woman that means light, radiance, brilliance, brightness. So my concept was I wanted to help shine the light on commercial leasing for small business tenants. So now I specialize in commercial leasing with a focus on helping small business tenants. And that's what I do all day, every day. And I love it. I'm very blessed to have the opportunity to serve small business owners and help them with their lease issues. I have my website here, mainly because I have a bunch of free resources for you there. So there's commercial leasing infographics. I have a glossary of commercial leasing terms. So if you're looking through your lease and you're like, what does this mean? You can check to see if it's in our glossary. If not, you can just shoot me an email and I'll add it to the glossary. I also have a lease cost calculator there, which is a tool that can help you figure out how much your lease is going to cost you. Plus, there's a bunch of links to real estate market reports and other websites that you might find valuable. And then finally, if you're on social, I'd love to connect with you there on Instagram at Ziva Law Hawaii. I am on other platforms, but Instagram is my favorite. So please connect with me there. Okay, so whenever I do these presentations, I like to share a random fun fact about myself, just to keep things fresh. So my random fun fact is that back in 2005, I was clerking for Judge Corrine Watanabe at the Intermediate Court of Appeals. And she was working on a special project to revamp certain aspects of the judicial system to make it more accessible to the public. So one assignment that we worked on was revising the traffic citation. And at the time, there were these problems with the traffic citation because the citation was multiple pages long. And so when a cop would, pull someone over, they're like flipping through these pages and the wind is blowing and it's a big mess. And then people would lose some of the pages and misplace them. And the directions in the citation were confusing and unclear. So a lot of people would misunderstand the directions and send their payment to the wrong place. And it was just utter chaos. So our task was to revise the citation so that it was clear and easy to understand and that everything fit on one page double-sided. So revising the citation to make it clear was pretty straightforward, but we really struggled to get everything on one page. And we tried all of the usual tactics like adjusting the margins, line spacing, font size, and everything, and nothing worked. So here is where my fun fact comes in. So my brilliant contribution to the traffic citation is that I said, hey, why don't we change the font to Arial Narrow? And it worked. And so that solved the problem. We fit everything on one page. And in my humble opinion, it's a very clean, modern sans serif font that is very easy to read. And so that's kind of the origins of the current version of the traffic citation. So the next time you see the traffic citation, hopefully it's not when you get a ticket, but when you notice that there's the Arial narrow font, then that is because of me. And I think it's still the same. The last time I checked, I think a few years ago, it was still Arial narrow. So now you know a random fun fact about me. And actually, I don't even think my husband knows that story. So all of you here today have one up on my husband with respect to random fun facts about Chenise. Okay, so let's get started. There is so much really that we could talk about when it comes to commercial leasing, but we only have about 40 minutes of time together today, not including the questions. So I want to keep it very simple. Today, we're going to focus on 3 aspects of commercial leasing to help guide a new startup business. So first, we're going to talk through whether you need to lease space right now. Second, I'm going to walk you through the commercial leasing process from start to finish so you know what to expect. And then third, I'll share some common commercial lease clauses so that you understand what they are and some considerations for startups in negotiating these lease terms. So starting a business is such an exciting time. And I remember loving this period of creativity and inspiration when you're literally building a business from scratch. So I remember like waking up in the middle of the night with all these ideas that I had to write down so I don't forget them. And that's the best time. So if that's where you are and that's the phase that you're in, congratulations. And I'm very excited for you. Now, it may seem like a natural first step in the business creating process to start searching for a location for your business. However, a commercial lease is a significant legal and financial obligation. It's also one of the single largest fixed operating expenses for small businesses. So especially in the early years of a business, you may encounter cash flow issues as your business gets off the ground. And during this time, it's really important to run your business as lean as possible and manage your operating costs, which includes your rent. So right now, I want you to push the pause button, take a step back, and ask yourself this preliminary question. Do I really need to lease space right now? Okay. And depending on the answer or depending on the nature of your business, you may not need a physical brick and mortar space to operate just yet. So there are lower cost alternatives that might allow you to launch your business while keeping costs down. So I want you to keep an open mind here. So if you have a service-based business, you might be able to work out of a home office and rent co-working space to meet with clients or Zoom or FaceTime to do meetings by video conference, which is something that we've all become accustomed to. And then if you have a retail or product-based business, you could start small by selling your products at a farmer's market, a craft fair, kiosk, or an online store. In the retail space, pop-ups are actually something that's becoming more common. This is an opportunity to license space on a short term, sometimes even on a month-to-month basis, but be in a more established location like a retail center, shopping center, mall, that kind of thing. For food-based businesses, you would have similar options as retail. And an additional option might be a food truck. So you could start off by having a food truck, which is some expense up front, but it might not be as large of a financial commitment as, say, entering into a longer term lease. And now don't forget, not now does not mean not ever, right? So once your business grows and is generating consistent revenue, then you can grow your business by leasing space with a little bit more confidence that the revenue you'll make will be able to support your rent. So after you ask yourself the question, do I need to lease space right now? If your answer is yes, Chenise, I do need to lease a physical space, then the next question is, how much space do you really need? It's easy to get caught up and overzealous with big, grand visions of what your business could potentially be, right? Like with the decor and all kinds of extravagant things. But because rent is usually tied to the size of the premises, you might consider starting with a smaller space and just take on more space as your business grows. So you want to aim to right size it and not bite off more than you can chew. Same goes for geographic areas. So, some areas are more expensive to lease than others. So in one area, for example, in the retail space might be $4 or $5 per square foot. But other places like in Waikiki is known to be pretty expensive for their lease rents, and you might be looking at rents $20, $25 a square foot, something like that. So maybe just keeping that in mind, right? So where you're starting off, make sure that the rent is going to be affordable for you and manageable. So now you've decided that you're going down the path of leasing a commercial space. So I want to walk you through the commercial leasing process so that you get a high-level overview of what it entails. The commercial leasing process typically involves these steps. So it's going to be finding a space, negotiating a letter of intent, conducting due diligence, and then negotiating and signing a lease agreement. And this infographic that you see right here is available for download on the resources page on my website. It's just a handy dandy map to navigate the process, and it covers all of the steps that we're going to talk about today. Step one is finding a space to lease. So there's basically two ways. There's a DIY approach, and then there is using a real estate agent or broker. So first on the do-it-yourself route, one of the leading public listing sites for commercial real estate is loopnet.com. So that's LOOPNET.com. It's pretty similar to when you're searching for a house or a condo for lease, and you might go on Zillow or apartments.com. LoopNet is the commercial real estate equivalent of that. So you can do searches on property type, size, geographic area, rent rate, all of that good stuff. And other ways to find spaces to lease are newspapers, trade magazines often have spaces available for lease. And if you're interested in a specific project, like, I want to be in Salt Kaka'ako or something, you can even reach out to the owner or the property manager directly and ask if there's any spaces available. Now, another option is to engage the services of a commercial real estate agent or broker. And you may be thinking, I don't want to really do that because I don't want to have to pay a commission, which is more expensive, right, when you're starting out. Typically, the real estate agent that represents the tenant is paid their commission by the landlord. So you can usually benefit from working with a broker at no cost to you. Now, there is a small chance that you would have to pay a commission, like if the landlord maybe doesn't use a leasing agent and is not willing to pay commissions. So it is a good idea to confirm the terms of the agreement with any broker before you sign a contract with them. Step two is negotiating a letter of intent, and I'll refer to this as an LOI, which is just the way it's commonly referred to in the industry. It can be titled different things. It might be called a proposal to lease, offer to lease, but essentially it's a short, usually non-binding agreement between a landlord and a tenant that outlines the key business terms of a proposed lease. It's the preliminary negotiation to see if the parties have a deal to move forward with before they start incurring expenses to hire attorneys to draft documents and all of that. An LOI is not required in every single transaction. Sometimes small landlords might not use them and they just go directly to the lease agreement. But it is common practice for most landlords to start with an LOI. Some terms that are commonly negotiated in the LOI are, it'll say the names of the parties, the address of the premises that you're leasing, what the premises can and cannot be used for, the term, the rent, the security deposit amount, whether a personal guarantee will be required, which is something we're going to talk a little bit more about later, the tenant improvement allowance, if any, and then any other special conditions or unique terms. As a word of caution, although most commercial lease LOIs are drafted to be non-binding, it is generally understood in the commercial real estate industry that if a party agrees to business terms in an LOI, that they're not going to retrade the deal later at the lease negotiation stage. So I have seen clients where, they signed an LOI and they really didn't even look at it carefully because someone told them it's non-binding, so it doesn't matter anyway. And then they kind of got locked into certain terms that were not good for them. So you really want to make sure that you read the LOI carefully to confirm that you are generally okay with their terms. And if there's any unique financial terms, you want to be negotiating that upfront with your landlord. Otherwise, the landlord may resist changes later on in the process. After the parties reach agreement on the LOI, then the landlord usually prepares a draft of the agreement, the lease agreement for the tenant's review. Okay, step 3 is due diligence. And I have this down as step 3, but it actually occurs throughout the commercial leasing process. And it's funny because due diligence investigations are considered a standard part of real estate or business purchase transactions. If you ever purchased the house, for example, you may have ordered a home inspection or a termite inspection report, and that's all basically part of your due diligence. But for some reason, many commercial tenants underestimate the importance of due diligence when negotiating a lease, and they do very little of it. So what is due diligence? Due diligence means gathering and evaluating information about your lease and your property before signing the lease so that you know what you're getting into. And of course, due diligence can be used in lots of different contexts. So I'm giving you kind of the description of what it is in the context of commercial leasing. The purpose of due diligence is really to minimize risks and protect yourself from surprises that could lead to could cost you money down the line. Sometimes tenants discover major issues that they decide are too much of a risk, and then they decide not to move forward with the lease at all. And in that case, it can actually save you from leasing a lemon. Other times, tenants may find issues that are moderate, but because they discovered it before they signed the lease, they're then able to negotiate with their landlord to either have the landlord take care of it at the landlord's cost, or share the cost. So sometimes the landlord and tenant will negotiate some kind of sharing of the cost. And I've seen, clients who do due diligence and they uncover asbestos problems, mold issues, roof issues, and a lot of that, based on the terms of the lease, would have been their responsibility if they had moved forward and signed the lease without knowing these things. So the circle you see here on the screen is the Ziba Law Complete Due Diligence Model. Now, it's just a framework that I created to help break down commercial lease due diligence into 4 categories so that you can make sure you're hitting all of these categories and do some complete due diligence. The 4 categories are landlord due diligence. So you want to look at what is the landlord's experience, background, and reputation. Number 2 is physical due diligence. So what is the physical condition and characteristics of the premises and the project? Legal due diligence. So what are the legal risks that are associated with this lease? And finally, financial due diligence. And that's really just making sure you have a good understanding of how much this lease is going to cost you. I also have a free commercial tenants due diligence checklist that's available on my website. So it's kind of a guide for due diligence and a checklist of some things to look for. We are having a little bit of technical issues with the landing page on that one. But if you are interested, please check back in a few weeks, or you can email me directly to get a copy of that. Okay, so now you found your space, you negotiated your letter of intent, and you completed your due diligence, and everything is all good. The last phase in the process is negotiating and signing your lease agreement. The lease agreement is a much longer document. It's often about, I would say, 40 to 80 pages on average, and sometimes as high as 100 to 200 pages. So sometimes I had this one client who spent months negotiating the letter of intent because she thought that was the lease. So she didn't want to sign it until she spent months negotiating it. And then she brought it to me to do the final review before she signed it. And I had to tell her, this is actually just the beginning. And then you're going to get a longer lease agreement that will be the actual formal legal document. So just know what to expect. And your lease agreement should contain the deal terms that you had negotiated in the LOI. Plus, it's going to have a lot of other provisions that govern the landlord-tenant relationship. Even though I know it can feel like torture, it is a good idea to actually read your lease and try your best to understand what your rights and obligations are. Then if you have any proposed changes or corrections at that point, you would communicate it to your landlord. And if you're working with an attorney, your attorney might draft the proposed revisions and send that over to the landlord for their review. Or if you're not working with an attorney, a lot of tenants will often just, send an email or something to the landlord's representative outlining their comments, and then the landlord's attorney would prepare revisions based on the comments. Now, after the landlord and tenant reach agreement on the form of the lease, both parties will sign the lease and any related lease documents. So before you sign the execution copy, you should double check to make sure that all blanks are filled in and all exhibits are attached and complete. You would be surprised at how many times these things fall through the cracks, which can lead disputes in the future, especially when like a key date is missing or something like that. Finally, be sure to get back a fully signed copy of the lease from your landlord and keep it in a safe place in your files. I always tell my clients, you know, your lease is kind of like your Bible when it comes to anything related to your lease throughout the lease term. So if an issue comes up, if you're wondering what to do in a situation, the first place you look is your lease. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears and we are going to talk about a few common commercial lease clauses. As Greg mentioned, the Business Law Corps will be publishing a Restart Hawaii handbook that corresponds to the webinars in this series. So in my chapter, I do cover 7 common commercial lease clauses. And for each one, I give a description, a sample clause, so you can see an example of what one might look like, and then a few considerations for startups in negotiating that clause. Now, in the interest of time, I am not going to be covering all 7 of those today. But you can get a copy of the handbook when it's available, and all of the information will be in there. Okay, so first up is the term of your lease. The term is the period that you as a tenant may legally occupy the space and the period that you're responsible for rent and other obligations like maintenance, repair, and other things. Commercial leases typically have terms of 3, 5, or 10 years. Although after COVID, I have seen a few shorter term leases, like 1 to 2 years, because people are not quite sure how long they want to commit to in this economy. Some considerations for startups. So if you are starting a new business, you might want to consider shooting for a shorter lease term. So more on the 3 to 5 year kind of term, rather than a longer 10-year lease. Once your business is established, then you can more comfortably commit to a longer term. Now, that said, if you are investing a significant amount of money in the build out of your space, then you generally want the term to be long enough to allow you to recoup on your initial investment. There are advantages and disadvantages to shorter versus longer terms, lease terms. So with a shorter term, you know, you have that ability to limit your financial obligation if the business doesn't work out. But a disadvantage is, you know, you risk losing that space. So if at the end of your lease term, your business is doing well and you want to stay, but you know, it's not guaranteed basically. So ideally, you want to weigh all of the considerations to determine a good lease term that's going to work for you and your business. One way to secure the right to stay in a space longer without overcommitting is an option to extend. An option to extend is a clause you would negotiate in your lease that gives you the right, but not the obligation, to extend your lease on agreed upon terms. So how it works is, you know, by a certain deadline before your lease expires, you would have the right to basically give your landlord written notice saying, I'm going to exercise my option. So for example, it might look like your initial term was a 5-year lease term with an option to extend the term for another 5 years. So that way you get the right to be in there for 10 years, but not the obligation. So this way, if you get to the end of your initial lease term and things are not looking so good with your business, you can just let the lease expire by its natural term and then you have no further obligation. But if your business takes off and you're killing it, you will have locked in that legal right to exercise the option and stay there longer. Next is rent. So this is usually top of mind for most tenants. The rent clause or clauses in your lease covers how much rent is to be paid to the landlord throughout the lease term in exchange for giving you, the tenant, the right to use the premises. Commercial leases often distinguish between a base rent or minimum rent and additional rent. So in a triple net lease structure where the landlord passes through nearly all of the costs of the tenant, the base rent is the net amount that the landlord will receive as the rent. But you as a tenant are also going to be responsible for some additional rent, which would cover things like common area maintenance expenses, utilities sometimes, real property and other taxes, and other landlord obtained insurance. So first, you want to try to negotiate your rent rate. In order to do this effectively without an agent or broker, you have to do your homework and research what are market rent rates. You can use some of the things we talked about earlier by going on LoopNet and seeing what's out there. Another way to do it is to look at the commercial real estate market report. So again, there's links to Collier's and CBRE's ones on my website. But basically, they publish quarterly market rent reports. So you can see based on the property type, based on geographic location, what's a reasonable range of what people are listing rent rates at, including common area space, common area maintenance expenses as well. Some first-time tenants assume that the listed rent is non-negotiable. They're thinking of it as like a menu when you go to the restaurant, and that's the list price, and that's the price you pay. But leasing agents often will list rent rates a little bit higher, expecting people to try to negotiate it down. So just keep that in mind. Next, know what your rent covers and any additional expenses that you're going to be responsible for under your lease. So the rent structure in leases can vary from lease to lease. So you want to really understand what your rent covers under your lease, including any other expenses that you could be responsible for so that you avoid any surprises. Some hidden costs could include requirements to maintain service contracts. So for example, air conditioning maintenance, pest control services. Some leases, require you to carry some, engage professional services for these things, and those costs add up. For restaurants, you may have to do regular professional cleaning of grease traps or hoods and those types of expenses. Next, rent increases. It is pretty common for commercial landlords to include annual fixed base rent increases. 2 to 3% annual increases are fairly customary. I have seen landlords trying for 3.5 to even up to 5% annual increases. So if you see it on the higher level, you might want to try to negotiate that down. Next is free rent. So you can often get a free rent period at the beginning of your lease, particularly if you're going to build out the space. Ideally, you do not want to have to start paying rent until you open for business. But keep in mind that your landlord may still require you to pay for your share of CAM or utilities during your free rent period. And then finally, the rent commencement date. So if you are able to negotiate a free rent period, your lease will probably distinguish between the commencement date, which is the date that you take possession of the premises or when you get the keys, and the rent commencement date, which is the date that you start paying rent. The rent commencement date can be heavily negotiated, usually as early as the LOI stage. So make sure that you pay attention to that. And this is where planning becomes critical. Be sure to negotiate enough time so that you can satisfy all of your obligations to open for business. A tenant build-out process can involve a lot of stages. You're going to be engaging maybe architects, engineers, contractors, applying for building permits, getting design approvals from landlord, the actual construction itself, shipping of materials, and then final inspections and closing out of your building permit. So all of this stuff takes time, and in Hawaii, the permitting process often takes long. There's construction delays are not uncommon. So you really want to work with your team all the way up front at this stage to get realistic estimates on the timeline for completing your build out, and then even pad it and account for possible delays as well. So again, your goal here is really to try to avoid a situation where you have to start paying rent before you open. Next is a security deposit. A security deposit is a sum of money that the tenant pays to the landlord at the beginning of the lease, which the landlord holds throughout the term to secure the tenant's obligations under the lease. I will say this one is not heavily negotiated usually, but I did want to touch on 2 points. So first is the amount. what's a standard amount for a landlord to require for a security deposit? That's a common question I get. The majority of commercial leases that I see are equal to 1 month's gross rent. I do occasionally see some landlords requiring 2 months. I would say it is worth your time to try to negotiate that down if you can, if your landlord is asking for 2 months, because a lot of times you can use that cash, toward your startup costs, and it's better spent there. So some landlords are willing to negotiate on that, and others are not. So it just depends on your landlord. Second is return of your security deposit. So if your lease does not say when the landlord is required to return your security deposit, you might want to try to negotiate a deadline in there. So you could ask for maybe 30, 60, or 90 days after you vacate the premises. And the reason why that's important is some leases don't have a deadline. So it's kind of just this open-ended thing. And then, tenants are stuck where landlords, it's months later and they left the property a long time ago and they can't get their security deposit back. So you really want to try to at least set it up so that you have something to point to and say, hey, Mr. Landlord, you have to give me my deposit back, in the lease says it by 60 days or something. And finally, the last one we're going to cover is the personal guarantee. A personal guarantee is a written promise from a guarantor, which can be an individual person. A lot of times for startups and small businesses, it's going to be the individual business owners of the entity, or it can also be a separate business entity. And it's to satisfy the tenant's obligations under the lease in the event of non-performance. Commercial landlords routinely require personal guarantees if the tenant is a limited liability entity. So if you attended the webinar earlier in this series about business entity formation and all the benefits of limited liability protection, I'm sure Ryan covered that. But the personal guarantee basically eliminates that protection with respect to your lease obligations. So if you as a business owner sign a personal guarantee, it allows the landlord to go after you personally if there's a default under your lease. So to be very clear, a personal guarantee does put your personal assets at risk. So what you need to know here is that personal guarantors typically have broad primary liability under a guarantee. So in the commercial leasing context, again, if the tenant defaults, then the landlord doesn't necessarily have to go after the tenant first. So the landlord can go after either the tenant or the guarantors or both. So that's a common misperception, because some people think they would have to go sue the tenant first and then they can sue you secondarily. But actually, most commercial lease guarantees are drafted where it's a primary liability. Now, the bad news is that it is very common for commercial landlords to require a personal guarantee as a condition of signing a lease. Especially for new businesses, because the tenant may have weak or non-existent financials. So from the landlord's perspective, they need some kind of assurances that you're going to be able to pay your rent. So I will say, if possible, try to avoid signing a guarantee. But practically speaking, and especially as a new small business tenant, you might not have the bargaining power to get out of signing one. So then what, right? Well, the good news is that there are some options. First, if you have enough cash available and you do have personal assets to protect, then you can try to negotiate by offering an alternative form of security instead of the personal guarantee. The most common alternative I see used by small business tenants is an increased security deposit. Okay, so that might look like 4 to 12 months worth of rent as a security deposit instead of the usual 1 month. Or in addition to the 1 month, depending on how it's negotiated. And another option is prepaying rent. So I've seen some landlords agree to get rid of the personal guarantee, but you have to prepay maybe 6 or 12 months worth of rent. Obviously, these are alternatives, but they are costly, right? You have to have the cash on hand to be able to pull this off. Second, if there are no viable alternatives, like maybe you don't have the money to be able to do that, and the landlord insists on the guarantee, you can try to limit your liability under the guarantee. You could try to have it, for example, expire after a certain period. So maybe you say if you're in a 5-year lease, say maybe after 2 years or 3 years, if you paid your rent on time, for that period, then it allows the guarantee to terminate. Another way to limit liability might be to cap the amount. So you might say that the liability under the guarantee will not exceed an amount equal to 12 months rent, something like that. So there are a few more lease clauses that I did not cover today that are covered in the lease chapter of the handbook. So I just put a list here of the clauses that are covered in the chapter. So you have an idea of what's there if you're interested and want to go check it out. Okay, so I want to leave you with a few final thoughts. Starting a business is a big deal, and signing a lease is a huge milestone on your journey of entrepreneurship. So don't take that responsibility lightly. Some tenants will sign leases that they don't even read. Or another common one is I see them delegate the responsibility to someone else, like their brother or their cousin, because they don't want to deal with it. And they really do suffer consequences later because they're the ones that are liable under the lease or the guarantee. So it is something that you want to take ownership and responsibility for as a business owner. It is 100% worth your time, energy, and resources to understand and participate in negotiating your lease. So you really understand what you're getting into. And my hope is for each and every one of you is that you will be an instrumental part in helping restart Hawaii and rebuild our community following COVID. So thank you for having the will and the courage to be a part of this change. So thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Chenise. That was awesome. We have time for questions now, and we have a question in the chat, which is, does the tenant need to retain an original signed copy of the lease, or can they just save it digitally?
Yeah, so a lot of times these days in modern contracts, business contracts as well as leases, they do include a provision in there that allows for counterpart and electronic signatures and all of that. I think under the electronics, signature statute, it also permits them, you to do that as well. So you don't necessarily have to have wet signatures, but some landlords are still operating from that, like they will require it. So they will ask you to have, to deliver wet signatures. So that might just be a landlord requirement.
So it depends on if the lease allows it, basically. Yeah. Okay. How do you work with clients, like especially small businesses that don't have a huge amount of budget for legal? What kinds of things do you offer to those sorts of people?
For me personally, that was one of the big things that I wanted to do differently with Ziba Law is for my lease review services anyway, I try to offer fixed fee limited scope packages that there's different scope of services for each package. So if you come meet with me, I will explain to you what's included in each package and what the price points are, and then you can make the best decision for what's the thing that best meets your unique needs for your business and your budget as well, right? Because I know everyone is in a different situation. Mm-hmm. And then I also have a service called Ziba Lease Consult that is even more contained. So some people just maybe have a question on how to interpret a few lease clauses, right? You don't need a full lease review. So it's just basically a targeted review of certain legal issues. And then I will review your lease in advance, and then I'll meet with you and have a consultation on just those issues. And then that way I'm able to offer it at a much more affordable price for small business owners.
So if they do their homework and then tell you exactly what they want you to look at, it's a lot easier to copy.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you also say it's a tenant that hasn't had a lot of lease experience? Would you be willing to take a quick look through it to say, well, these are some clauses that I think I should look at more closely, or, because I find that sometimes clients are in that situation. They're not even sure what's important, right? And
yeah. It depends. So I've actually seen situation. It depends on what the client what their expectations are, right? Mm-hmm. So I sometimes see clients who come in and they don't have a big budget, but their expectation still is that you're, looking through and going to catch everything that's possible. And to be honest, there are situations where I've caught clauses in leases that were really harmful to the client, and they weren't in an obvious place. Like they were buried all the way in the back, right? So as long as the client is willing to accept that risk, right? So I would be very clear about, this is all that I am going to be looking at. And if you're okay with that, then that would be fine.
Yeah, we face that all the time in startup work because, if the client's seeking a guarantee from me, then,
Yeah.
I'll just move on.
Yeah.
Not an insurance company.
Yeah.
We have a interesting question about with people going out of business, especially these days. Is it better, or what are the pros and cons or factors in just assuming the current lease versus going to the landlord and doing a new lease?
I think it's cleaner. So you're talking about like whether you sublease from someone or like that,
No, well,
or you're selling a business.
The question is really take over an existing lease versus doing your own lease with the landlord. So it would be an assignment of lease.
Yeah, so an assignment. Yeah.
Yeah.
The main disadvantage to that is you don't have the ability to negotiate. So you have less ability to negotiate if you're doing an assignment, because usually it's just going to be an assignment of the whatever the lease was, that's what you're accepting, and they usually got to get landlord's consent to that, and that's it. So you have limited. I mean, sometimes people ask me to do a review of the lease in connection with an assignment, but it's really more going to be for your own peace of mind to know there's not anything major that would actually maybe prevent you from moving forward with that transaction, right? So because it's not like you're going to go in and say, I want to negotiate 20 things in the lease, because the landlord's going to scoff at that. So if you have the ability to do just a straight new lease, then a lot of times I find people prefer to do it that way. But it depends on the situation and whether the landlord's willing to do that, and all of that.
I guess if the lease is really favorable,
Yeah,
wouldn't
absolutely.
offer it again, then maybe that's a situation where
Exactly.
you try to take an assignment.
Yeah. So do you want to, is the deal so good, right, that you want to just keep it as it is, even though there may be some bumps or some things that are not ideal, versus entering into a new deal and where there's more possibility for change or modifications on either side?
The landlord could always try to deny consent to the assignment, so it's not a slam dunk, right?
Yep.
The other thing that occurs to me is if you take an assignment and an existing lease, you're assuming everything that went wrong prior to the lease, possibly, because you should look at how the assignment's written to make sure you're not assuming all prior actions. It was a slip and fall on the property or some problem that was created by the prior tenant. You can also always go after the prior tenant, but they may not have the money to pay for it. So that's a danger, I think. I have a question here. The audio is, if you're having problems with the audio, please mention it. I know we have one comment here. Here's a question. I was kind of wondering the same. My experience limited on leases is that, like you said, if you come in with 20 points, they're going to just say, come back with fewer points if you want the lease, because landlords like you to just sign the lease as is, right? I mean, if it's 50 pages, they're not going to want to spend a lot of time rewriting everything. So in your experience, what is the like, how many areas of change do you negotiate without saying to the client, you're really going to be unsuccessful if you're asking for this volume of changes? Do you just sort of a handful would be optimal?
I don't know that it's as easy as quantifying it like that, because really when I'm going into lease negotiation, it depends on so many factors, right? So I'm looking at who is the landlord, first of all, right? Like, what is my understanding of the reputation of the landlord and how they negotiate? That's going to give me a better idea of, can we go in with more stuff and ask? Because sometimes we just ask, because you'd be surprised. Sometimes, tenants talk themselves down from asking for things that they can get. So sometimes the approach or the strategy is just going in and asking for everything, within reason, reasonable things, right? Asking for whatever you need or want that can help your business. And then if the landlord will come back and they'll say yes to some, no to some, and then you got to figure out how you want to proceed. But at least taking that shot at trying, right?
I guess it also depends on who is the tenant.
Yes. Absolutely. I told them, I told my clients that too. Like if you are Target or Walgreens, like you're an anchor tenant, you can negotiate, you have a lot more bargaining power, right? But if you're a small mom and pop tenant, you have less bargaining power. So there's a lot of factors that go into assessing that. But then that's why it's a little bit different in every negotiation and how you want to approach it. And then some people tell me like, no, all I care is about these 5 things. So then we'll just go in with that. So it depends.
But just because you're small doesn't mean that they won't really want you. Um,
No, not at all.
we have a client, Mana Up, and Rural Hawaiian wanted them to be in the shopping center.
Mhm.
So, that's kind of nice, right? It gives
Yeah.
so don't shortchange yourself on that. I mean, part of it is pitching the landlord how exciting your business is. If you
Yes.
get excited about it, you're going to have, a more eager landlord, I assume.
Yeah. And especially in this market, right? This post-COVID economy, in the retail sector, there's lots of opportunities out there. People are getting some good deals. They're getting
Right.
into centers that they don't think they would have been able to get in before because they're so small. So there are opportunities out there. Don't underestimate your bargaining power in that way either.
Now, this is a tough question. I think you sort of covered it already, is what are the provisions that would be most optimal to negotiate in a lease? And I think the answer is probably it depends on the situation. So we can't
Yeah.
size fits all, but I think the topics that Chenise covered, I assume are covered because those are often the ones that come up. But, do you have any further remarks on that?
Um, yeah, it really depends on even your business. So I try to, in my practice, I try to also take into consideration what are your specific business needs and all of that. And that is going to impact what's going to be important to you and what's going to be important to negotiate in your situation. Um, the ones that I covered are common and things that you want to pay attention to. I would say another one that you can commonly negotiate is the relocation provision.
Hmm.
So a lot of retail and even office leases will have a clause that the landlord can relocate you at any time. And of course there's usually some things built in there to compensate you for the relocation, but a relocation can be hugely disruptive to a business, right? So I've had lots of success in totally eliminating the relocation clause. And then if not, we try to go in and just put some limits on it. So it's reasonable, if that were to happen, you have some reasonable assurances that it's not going to be totally be as disruptive as it could potentially be to your business. And
Okay.
that's one that's at the end oftentimes, right? It's like buried all the way in the back. So be on the lookout for that one.
Yeah, I've seen that come up for sure.
Yeah.
Uh,
And in retail, like I've heard people say like, oh, but that doesn't happen. I'm okay with that because that's like 1 in a million chance of happening. And I've seen it happen many times.
oh yeah.
One of the Waikiki retail shops, they were relocated 5 times during their lease term.
Well, and
So it does
you
happen.
might like your current location.
Yeah, exactly. And I've seen situations where people were on the ground floor, so they had that good foot traffic coming, and then they get relocated to the second floor, and that can be devastating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, so use of premises provisions. Do you have any advice on that? Or have you seen that become a problem in any of your situations?
Yeah, so I did cover that in the chapter. So use of the
Okay, okay.
premises. So you can definitely check that out. But generally you want to try to make the use as broad as you can. So that it gives you some flexibility, both for your own business operations and if in the future, as an exit strategy, you might want to assign the lease or sublease or something like that. It gives you more flexibility on who you can assign to. But the landlord's perspective, of course, is most of the time they're trying to get it as narrow as possible. So it's kind of that's where the negotiation and the bargaining has to happen.
I guess
Um,
you have to understand that they're trying to have a mixed use in their
yeah,
center. And so if you can shift over to, from a retail store to a coffee shop, but they already have Starbucks right next
yes,
to you, they
yeah,
might not be real pleased with that. So, just,
yeah.
I think you want to make it a win-win for them too. Question is, what do we do? When should you sign an LOI? I mean, I think you talked about the fact that you shouldn't sign it unless you're ready to go,
Mhm.
right? But do you have any other feedback on that question?
When should you sign the LOI relative to what though? I guess what was my to get clarification on that question.
Probably relative to their business development. You know, I'm guessing, you know, their startup. You said a lot of people sign it too early. They're not even ready to launch their business.
Yeah. So once you sign the LOI, and then things are going to progress pretty quickly, right? So then you're going to move on to the lease negotiation stage. You know, some clocks can start ticking, you know, very very soon after that once you sign the lease. So you want to make sure that you're ready for sure. And so that's why I kind of talked about even at the LOI stage, you're going to want to know, like, what is your plan for your build out and all of those things. And a lot of people aren't ready yet to even know, you know, what kind of construction project am I going to be doing, and who's going to do it, and how long is it going to take. So you want to be at least in a position where you have some of those things mapped up. Maybe you talk to a few architects, you have an idea of timeline, that kind of thing.
If that didn't answer your question, please repost. We had a question about the manual. It's going to come out within a couple months, and everyone on this webinar will get an email link because you've been nice enough to join us for these 8 weeks. So I guess keep an eye out for that. I have a question, and this might sound like a Debbie Downer question from that, referencing the old Saturday Night Live series. Lawyers tend to be like that. But my question is, I've seen situations come up where the tenant signs, let's say, a 5-year lease, and then the business doesn't do well. And they're like, how do I get out of this? I'm like, well, you can't get out of it. I mean, you know, you might be able to get them to mitigate damages. They might replace you, but that's out of your control. I mean, are there ways to negotiate your lease so you can minimize your downside if things don't work out and rely on the good faith of the landlord?
It's not common to have a lease clause in there that you negotiate that would give you the right to terminate just because things don't go okay. Usually the exit strategies that you're looking at in that scenario are an assignment or sublease of the situation. We have negotiated with landlords on early terminations, so it's not common, but it's possible. There are, if you can get the landlord to agree to it, you can negotiate rights to terminate. So maybe you might say after 2 years or whatever, if you're not making a certain revenue or some kind of benchmark, then maybe you have the right, a one-time right to terminate within a certain period, like, some kind of limitations on there. It's possible, but of course it just depends on what the landlord is willing to do.
So most people, if they run into trouble, they just either get sued by the landlord or, settle with the landlord somehow.
Settle, assign it, sublease.
Yeah. Oh, right. Assign it. Well, I was thinking more in nature of maybe a buyout clause where you'd say something like, we can terminate, but we have to pay you 6 months rent or something.
Yeah, it's possible. So like that's where I said, like, usually it'll be structured in a way where at a certain benchmark, at a certain period point in the lease, like maybe after 2 years, then you would have a period of time where you could terminate, and you would have to pay some kind of termination fee and that kind of thing.
So I think we have to bear in mind that landlords are suffering too, right? And you can't just say, well, I'm going to stop paying you now because I can't when you.
Yeah.
Okay. If there are any final questions, please post them. Otherwise, I think we're just about out of time. Chenise has kindly offered to stay on line for a few minutes after we close the webinar. So if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to stay on, and we'll stay on for a few minutes afterwards. Thank you again for your participation. We will email the links to the recordings as well as the final manual when we've got it all put together. I want to thank Chenise for a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot from it. You're very organized, and I'd highly recommend reaching out to Chenise if you need help. I think that's it. So thanks everyone for coming. Be on the lookout for our links, and otherwise have a great day. Thanks for all you guys do. Bye-bye. Thanks, Chenise. We'll just stay on for a few minutes and see if there's follow-up questions. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to turn on your voice and ask them.
I do have one follow-up question.
Okay, Valerie, go ahead.
Excuse me, I'm not sure if this is answerable. Hi, Chenise, how you
Hi,
doing?
Bill. Good.
So I have a client who's looking to open a dance studio, so dance classes, performances, that sort of thing. And they found a warehouse zoned industrial that
Mhm,
they like.
mhm.
Would that be a violation of the zoning regulations to have a sort of retail dance studio in an industrially zoned warehouse?
They would have to look into, I would say the starting point would be the land use ordinance, because even though like industrial is a broad use, right? So depending on how it's zoned, there may be some other uses that are permitted in industrial spaces. So I will say, zoning and land use issues are sometimes more of an issue with industrial spaces, because sometimes people lease spaces and don't realize that it actually violates the law. So they do want to, probably do their homework and look there first to see if their dance studio use is going to be permitted in that area. And sometimes it is. I've seen some of the dance studios out in like the YPO area and stuff like that.
Yeah,
Now,
I've
would the landlord be able to tell them if they can do
You
that?
can ask, but usually, usually the lease is going to say, this is all on you, and it's your responsibility to do your due diligence and ensure that if it's not, then it's basically on the tenant. That's usually a common provision in the lease. But it's worth asking because then they might know.
Because they
So
may
I
not
would
have a
say,
problem either, right? It's going to be their problem as well.
yeah, absolutely, and that's what I say. So I would ask first to find out whatever information the landlord knows, but then do your own homework and kind of look into it as well.
Okay, and so if it's DPP, will they answer such a question if the landlord doesn't know and they have to, like you say, research the land use ordinance? Is that a
Yeah, you can
DPP?
call DPP. They're pretty helpful. I would say you can look in the land use ordinance. There's actually a table, like a permitted use table, and so you can look on basically whatever the zoning classification is. Then it'll say, there's a table that provides all the permitted uses, what's permitted, not permitted. Sometimes like I've looked in there and it's unclear. So like I have a use that I'm not sure which category it falls under. So I've called the DPP and they're pretty helpful in kind of giving you guidance on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Are they
You're
the
welcome.
ones who would enforce that, Chenise?
Excuse me?
They would enforce the
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where I would call the people that would enforce it, because
Yeah, exactly.
I want to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Say I don't know, then how's the public going to do the right thing if they don't know, right?
Yeah.
So,
And sometimes it requires a little bit more research. So I've actually been, engaged to help with limited issues on use, because sometimes it's not covered by the land use ordinance. So you have to go look in the title, to see what's recorded on title. Sometimes there've been a conditional use permit or something that outside of the land use ordinance that's going to give them the right to use it for a specific use.
someone asked, is it DPB or DPP?
Oh no, it's DPP, so Department of Planning and Permitting.
Okay. Any other questions for Chenise before we let her go?
Hi, yeah, I have a question for you. We are looking at a space that was a medical office and it had a lot of rooms in it. And we would, if it worked out, need to really, remodel and take out most of the rooms. But we're, pretty dead set on the space. So if I understand correctly, we get an architect over there to assess what the cost would be first, and then if that works out, then go through to the letter of intent, or is there a step in there that I'm missing?
So have you been informally in conversations with a landlord representative about it so far?
Yeah. And this is a situation in which there is currently a leaseholder for the next 2 years who would like to get bought out, but because we would need to do so much construction on this space, we'd rather just speak with the owner of the property. And it's been, difficult to be direct with that person because we have to go through their realtor. And so, yeah, we have been in conversation with him through a realtor.
Yeah. That's typically the progression. So, you would have the preliminary conversations first, and then if it seems like there's interest on both sides, then it would progress to the letter of intent stage. And that's where you're going to have the deal terms that we talked about. And then you negotiate there and you move to the lease agreement. So, if you already had those preliminary conversations, then, if both parties are interested in proceeding, then you can move forward to the letter of intent. Unless there's anything specific that is, needs to be resolved maybe before you want to move forward.
No, but I know that we'll contact you when we're ready for the letter of intent.
One factor is how good the property is, because once the landlord might find another tenant right in the meantime. So
Yeah,
if
yeah.
it's too long, if it's a good, I assume it's a good spot. Otherwise, you wouldn't want to lease it. But not that you should rush into it, but you want to lock the landlord down too, right? With the letter of intent. So
Yeah.
even though it's non-binding, they're
Even
not
though
going
it's not binding, but yeah, yeah.
marketing it actively as a practical matter if they think they've got you lined up.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions from the gallery? If not, thank you for coming. If the attendees could sign off, we're just going to close our session now with the panel. But thank you for coming, everyone.